Okay, so here in Krita, we've already established that the software already comes preloaded with tons of great brushes. Now, unfortunately, with Krita, you can't import my brushes. Krita simply doesn't allow for that format. So right off the bat here, I want to cover how to import custom brushes that other artists have made for Krita. If you do a Google search for free Krita brushes, you'll probably come upon the site of David Revoy. This is his Krita brush kit version 8.2. If you scroll down, it's got all the brushes in the pack. It's got pencils and erasers and pens and paint brushes and all kinds of cool effects. And you can download it for free. You can also support him on Patreon up here. Anyway, get to the bottom of where all the graphics are. You can download it. Now back in Krita, to import a downloaded brush kit, go to Settings, Manage Resources, and you will have a window that looks like this. You will not have these DVAD brushes because that's the pack I just downloaded. I have already imported them here. To import them yourself though, simply go to Import Bundles, pick the bundle file you just downloaded, hit Open, and then make sure that bundle, which in this case is this one, is in the Active Bundles box, not the Inactive Bundles box. This is also, by the way, how you would deactivate certain brushes. Just take this one, push the side arrow here, and it would go into the inactive set, but we want them to be in the active set. If you click the David brushes there and go to brush presets, you can see all the brushes we just downloaded for free. And David Revoy is just one of many artists who provide free Krita brushes. Always consider supporting these artists on Patreon. Okay, so you would hit OK. I'm just going to hit cancel because I've already imported them. And if I click on all now, I have these David brushes here. Okay, you don't have to use that, of course. I'm just going to click myself over to the sketch category. And here's a default Krita pencil. Much like we've seen, you can sketch with it. Undo is this button here, or Control Z. Right click will bring up the menu. Different brushes will have different levels of texture preloaded in them. And once again, I really find these more visual graphics really handy when it comes to evaluating a brush before you select it. Photoshop has always not been ideal in that regard. I'll head on over to the paint set. Now this is where something interesting occurs. This brush here, of course, will allow me to paint a color in a pretty standard way. But some of these brushes have these little water icons. I'll pick this one here to show you. The water icons denote blending capabilities, almost like Photoshop's smudge tool. So you can see as I put this stroke down, it's interacting with that turquoise color I have on the canvas. If I decrease the opacity, let me just pick a different color, it essentially affects how much pigment is on the brush. So less opacity will turn this more into a pure blending brush, and more opacity, I'll get that color that I have selected being more influential on the mix. And right away, this really looks like traditional paint. And just like Photoshop, you have different brush presets. Like this looks like a sort of a soft, well, the icon is a Q-tip, so it's kind of a soft Q-tip-like cotton surface. True to a Q-tip, it does not seem to hold much pigment, even though my opacity is at 100% here. See, I'm picking a color and that green is just barely showing up, if at all. We'll try a different blending brush here. When it comes in at 100% opacity, it's pretty strong. I like to decrease the opacity almost by default. That's kind of like my first instinctual move when I use a blending brush in Krita, is to decrease the opacity to somewhere in the 70s or 80s. That seems to be a sweet spot. I really like this rake blender. Again, I'll decrease the opacity on it. This really reminds me of a lot of the rake-like tools I have in my traditional painting setup, where I use like old toothbrushes and literal plastic rake brushes to get all kinds of effects just like this. It's almost like cross-hatching, but with paint. Here's a palette knife blending tool. Really interesting effects you can get. And again, this brush doesn't seem to hold any of its own color, but if I choose more of a standard paintbrush like that, it will. It's funny, even though I recommended putting the brushes on the right, more and more these days I find myself simply clicking on this button and accessing the same folder. I don't know, for some reason I just find this really handy. Be sure to check out the ink brushes. There's so many really cool drawing tools here. This one that creates almost these little accidental calligraphic patterns. Really, really appealing. Or if you want something more standard, like a pen tip, you can go with something like this. This will just give you exactly what you expect. Very responsive too. I actually find the brushes in Krita, in general, a little more responsive than Photoshop. And we're talking like milliseconds here. And I'm running a fairly fast machine too, and I still notice a difference between Krita and Photoshop, Krita being faster. And much like we saw in Photoshop, if you want to erase, instead of using your stylus as eraser, simply go up here, go to the eraser category and, just choose an eraser brush and erase away. Okay, it's time to talk about customizing your brushes. One thing you might have noticed as I just used my eraser tool is that it's a very hard eraser. And I don't really like that. I want my tablet pressure to affect my eraser tool. So if you click on the brush icon you're using up here, it brings up the most complicated looking window known to man. The Krita designers must have been on break that day. But okay, let's make some sense of this. This entire window is concerning this eraser brush. It's the brush you have active. If I want to enable the opacity of the brush and link it to my pen pressure, I would go to the Opacity tab and click Enable Pen Settings. Pressure is already clicked on. And many brush settings are controlled with these curves. Just like in Photoshop, you get a preview of your stroke up here. So if I just adjust this curve, you can get a sense of what it's doing. You also have a little handy brush stroke window here, although this is odd because I'm using an eraser. This works better with a brush tool. But for now, we can adjust it this way. Once you're happy with your brush adjustment, you can say Save to New Brush Preset or Overwrite the brush. I'm going to hit Overwrite in this case because I always want this eraser to have this property. So Overwrite. Now this eraser responds to pressure, and because I overwrote the brush, it'll remain that way even if I went to a different brush and then returned to that eraser. Alright, let's try this with a regular brush though. I've picked this sort of marker style brush. I'll click into that settings window here. Brush tip is the first one, and that's where you might want to start. And by the way, now we can get a sense for what this scratch board does. Click the red button to reset it. It's very handy. Here you can simply change the default size of the brush. The ratio will control its width, sort of X versus Y ratio essentially. So by turning it down, I've almost got more of a calligraphic style brush. You can unlink horizontal and vertical and sort of change the opacity of the brush depending on its X or Y axis. This is kind of interesting. In fact, I think in this case, it looks more like an actual marker this way. The angle setting changes the rotation of the brush. And once again, you're looking at these previews up here, right? As I change the angle, you can see what it's doing and then use the scratch board to verify it, or really use a scratch board to feel it out. Density controls, I guess you can think of it as how much pigment is on the brush. So as I turn down density, it's almost like this marker's dying, although it's a very digital simulation of that, I guess. So let's turn this back up for now, and I'll turn a few of these back here. The mask type can help soften the brush a little bit. I'm on the soft setting here, but usually default is fine. Okay, we've already established to add opacity. You go in here, make sure this is on, and you can adjust your curve. Krita also gives you some preset curves to play around with. If you add a point by accident and want to delete it, just drag it aggressively off the frame. The other major setting of any brush would be its size. We want the size to be affected by the pressure as well. So I just clicked on size. So size is the property we're controlling, and you can control it now via all these inputs. I just want it to be controlled by pressure, which is the most common one. So pressure is active, and I can change the curve and get my nice update here. I'll just clear that off and see if I like it. Maybe I want it to go a little even thinner, so I'll go like this, and there we go. That's kind of what I want out of my marker. You could, of course, enable any of these and change their curves. Although when you do, I do recommend clicking off this Share Curve Across All Settings. Click that off. Unfortunately, that means I have to reset this curve. But then if I say clicked on a different one, I have a unique curve by which to edit that input property. Okay, when it comes to the color modes, you can get a little crazy here. If I clicked on, say, saturation, I can control the saturation of the brush based on pressure in this case, and you can see what it's doing. If I press lightly, there's no saturation. I press hard, there's saturation of the color. This is interesting. It's nice that you can do that. I'm not sure exactly when I would do that, but hey, it's cool to have that feature, and now you basically know how it works, right? So even though this window looks needlessly complicated, it is actually quite simple. It's the same workflow over and over. The textures can be interesting. Oh, and by the way, you can unfurl these to make it a little cleaner to look at. But anyway, let's unfurl texture, turn on pattern, and now I can pick any of these patterns which would affect what my brush looks like. This is obviously quite digital looking, so be careful when you're using patterns. To control the strength of the pattern, it's under the Options tab. Here you can scale it, change the brightness or contrast, and with these curves you can make it a little less noticeable. And okay, I think that concludes our overview of the brush editor window. We'll just click out of it here. And this is what's nice about Krita. It's only got the one brush tool. Unlike Photoshop that had the smudge tool and the mixer brush tool and the regular brush tool and the pencil tool. Here you just got one. Except for this guy right here, which honestly I have never used in my life. But you can pretty clearly see what it does. Might be good for making like wallpaper patterns or something. Or like a bathroom tile texture you could repeat and warp in perspective. Anyway, let's move on now to Procreate.